Welcome to the Mondoweiss podcast. I'm Dave Reed. Joining me today are Faris Giacaman and Qassam Muaddi, our new staff writer based in Ramallah. We are now past 180 days into this brutal genocidal war on Gaza, and it feels like events there and across the region are accelerating over the past couple of weeks. I wanted to have both of you on the podcast to talk about some of the key events and narratives you've been following. Let's start with Al-Shifa Hospital in Gaza. Faris, can you give us some background on Al-Shifa Hospital? What is it, and what does it mean for Palestinians in Gaza?
Sure. Well, briefly, Al-Shifa Hospital is the largest hospital in Palestine, the largest Palestinian hospital, and it is essentially the nerve center of the health system in Gaza. So, in previous wars, it has served as a very important hub for anything from, the health system itself to refugees who are coming in fleeing the bombardment to, police forces and civil defense teams to coordinate dispatching rescue efforts, all of that. And what this has essentially meant is that these kinds of hospitals, and Al-Shifa most of all, have become a kind of a pivotal sort of social institution in a sense, especially during wartime. And Al-Shifa was kind of the key in the early days of the Israeli genocidal campaign in Gaza. It was kind of the key to securing the ethnic cleansing of the north. The estimation of the Israelis was that if we're able to cause the fall of Al-Shifa, then it'll be able to successfully empty out northern Gaza because no one will have anywhere left to go to. So this is the context in which we should be looking at the invasion of Al-Shifa now and its subsequent destruction, which occurred just a few days ago.
Faris, can you describe the actual hospital itself? That's one thing that has come up with reader feedback, not understanding how so many people can fit into a hospital.
Right. Well, so the hospital isn't just one building. It's a very large medical complex composed of many different buildings with a large central courtyard. And it has the capacity, its grounds have the capacity to house many, many people. And before the latest invasion and destruction of Al-Shifa, it was estimated to house around 30,000 displaced people from the north of Gaza. So it's essentially a very large medical complex that has become a hub for displaced people and served as a microcosm of Palestinian civil society. So it's kind of been essential for the maintenance of the presence of the Palestinian population in northern Gaza.
Qassam, can you explain what happened there over the past few weeks?
Sure. So what happened in the past 2 weeks is important to remember that it's the second raid to Al-Shifa because Israeli forces raided Al-Shifa back in November and forcibly evacuated it. At the time, we're hearing all these claims by the Israeli government and the Israeli army that there's somehow a military base for the Palestinian resistance underneath Al-Shifa that was never found. And then the Israeli forces force everybody to leave Al-Shifa and leave behind the newborn, prematurely born babies without incubators. What happened next is that as soon as the Israeli forces began to withdraw from Gaza City, from the surroundings of Al-Shifa, Palestinians went back to Al-Shifa and began to use it again, both as a hospital and as a refuge. At the time, journalists reported finding those babies basically decomposing. What happened is that return gave a signal that Israel's campaign, at least the impression that it gave, is that Israel's efforts to stop all forms of life in Gaza City and in the north weren't quite successful because as soon as it withdrew, Palestinians were back and trying to get life back on the track. So this might explain, in a sense, why Israel raided Al-Shifa a second time on March 18th. And for 2 weeks, what the Israeli army did in Al-Shifa was basically systematically destroy the equipment and the infrastructure and the facilities. From the accounts and the testimonies of the medical staff and residents, in the past 2 days after the withdrawal, entire floors were set on fire. The equipment was intentionally broken and damaged. Al-Shifa had 750 rooms, 32 ICUs, 26 surgery operation rooms. All of them were destroyed. Dozens of rooms were destroyed. The equipment was completely destroyed, damaged. Entire floors set on fire, as I said. And also, the most appalling thing is the dead bodies that were found. Testimonies have it that many bodies were found hands tied or hands cuffed and shot, not only in Al-Shifa, but in the surroundings of Al-Shifa. Up until this morning, there were reports coming of recovering even more bodies. The first account spoke about 500 bodies, people killed, then 200. The Israeli army, from the beginning, said that they killed 200 terrorists. But we know from the accounts that many of those killed were medical staff, nurses, journalists, just residents in the surroundings of Al-Shifa. And in the words of the World Health Organization spokesperson, just yesterday, the Al-Shifa complex will not serve as a hospital in any form after today. So the Al-Shifa hospital basically doesn't exist anymore. That's what Israel actually did in Al-Shifa. It destroyed the largest medical facility in all of the Palestinian territories.
Do we know how many people were sheltering there when this second raid began?
No, we don't have an exact figure, but there were in the thousands.
The last number that I saw was that it was estimated that almost 30,000 were housing there.
Yeah.
It's obviously not easy to make a definitive estimation, but it's probably in the order of tens of thousands of people.
So this raises the question of why Israel would focus so much military power on Al-Shifa. You both mentioned that a little bit, and other hospitals. Faris, you wrote a piece the other day arguing that Israel has been attacking hospitals to bring about a collapse of civil society. I want to read a little bit from your article, and we'll link to it in the show notes. Mm-hmm. You wrote, hospitals in Gaza during times of war have not only served as places for the treatment of the wounded and the sick, but have become pivotal social institutions, housing a microcosm of Gaza's entire civic order. They became hubs for journalists and human rights defenders, offered space for Gaza's civil defense teams to organize and coordinate rescue efforts, became a base of operations for Gaza's police force, and hosted tens of thousands of displaced refugees seeking shelter from the bombardment. Hospitals became all those things because they were the last remaining civilian institutions that were supposed to enjoy a modicum of protection from the war. In other words, they housed all the trappings of what makes a society function. In lieu of dismantling Gaza's resistance infrastructure, a goal that remains elusive for the Israeli army, one of Israel's war aims in Gaza has been to engineer social collapse. So why is Israel trying to engineer social collapse in Gaza?
Well, the short answer is because social collapse will facilitate the thinning out of the population of northern Gaza, to facilitate the ethnic cleansing of northern Gaza, which would be consistent with Israel's stated aims of bifurcating Gaza between the north and the south, and having the north as empty as possible of people. And this is actually one of the key sticking points in the negotiations over a hostage swap. The sticking point being that the Hamas negotiating team is insisting that people be allowed back into the north, and Israel doesn't want that, and it's suggested as one of its counters to allow for only the women and children to go into the north after having passed some sort of security check. So this Israeli insistence just on that point in the negotiations shows very clearly that Israel isn't interested in allowing people to go back to their homes in northern Gaza, and it would like to maintain some form of permanent military presence, at least in the north, if not in all of Gaza. And it seeks to do so also by rendering northern Gaza uninhabitable. And Al-Shifa has been a very important component of that. Now, just to go back a sec, I wanted to maybe give a little bit of background on how we were sort of led up to this goal that Israel had. So, first of all, on March 17th and March 18th, two events sort of happened in concomitance to one another that I think, even though they didn't necessarily appear to be related, are actually very integral to one another. First of all, on March 17th, you had a miraculous arrival of 13 aid trucks to northern Gaza. It had been the first time in months that trucks had actually arrived in the north, because in previous times, whenever they would have reached the Nablus or Kuwaiti roundabouts, which were the areas that usually the trucks go through in order to arrive into the north and pass the Israeli checkpoint, there people would swarm the trucks, and then the Israeli army would shoot on the crowds, and it would lead to massacres of hundreds of people, one of the most infamous being the Flower Massacre on February the 29th, I believe.
Right.
And so on March 17th, what happened is that there was an arrival of all of these aid trucks in Jabalia refugee camp without incident. And the background to that is that in the days before, there were these pamphlets that were being distributed across of all of northern Gaza, basically signed by the Palestinian security forces, saying that or instructing everyone not to go to the Nablus or Kuwaiti roundabouts because there was a shipment arriving, and for them to rather wait for the relevant authorities to tell them where what gathering points to go to. And the remarkable thing is that everyone abided by that, and so they arrived in an orderly fashion, and then the actual distribution in Jabalia refugee camp was also done in an orderly way. People were waiting in lines, and they were also having their different rations recorded into a system according to their ID cards. So these were kind of the typical trappings of the sort of the bureaucracy of the Hamas government, the civilian arm of the government. So obviously, for Israel, it is unacceptable to have any form of civic order because the government is Hamas, and it doesn't care if they happen to all be civilians, and if they happen to be in the civilian wing of the government, they're basically just clerks. For them, that is unacceptable because it means that Hamas has been able to consolidate or to sort of restore a certain degree of social organization and cohesion in the north, and Israel couldn't have that. The very next day, it launched the invasion of Al-Shifa on March 18th. And on that first day of the invasion, it assassinated the head of operations of the Gaza police force, Faye al-Mabhouh. He was assassinated along with a few dozen other people in Al-Shifa. And the assassination of al-Mabhouh comes in the context of Mabhouh being one of the key central figures who organized the convoy to arrive in Al-Shifa the day before. Now, Faye al-Mabhouh was not a military person. He was in the police force. He was part of the civilian government. Of course, the Israeli claims were that he was a top Hamas commander. And the entire propaganda claim of the Israeli army has been that there is a new, renewed military presence of Hamas in Al-Shifa, of course, without providing any evidence. The only quote-unquote evidence we've seen is of pictures of weapons that they filmed inside of the hospital. Of course, how those weapons got there, we have no idea. But it's literally not offered a single shred of evidence other than that footage.
And this is the second. This is at least the second time that they've aired footage of weapons in a hospital. Also, the second time the weapons have been stored in an MRI room.
Yeah, which is probably not the best place to store a bunch of guns. So and the Al-Shifa, the first invasion back in November, has kind of been. It's become mostly recognized that the claims of a command and control center were completely untrue and was just an Israeli lie. And even the other claims of, well, they were hiding some weapons or whatever, or that there was military activity being conducted from within Al-Shifa, they found no evidence of that as well. They also found no evidence that whatever tunnels may have been under Al-Shifa, there was no evidence that those tunnels could be accessed from within the hospital. So really, that kind of connection has been tenuous at best, if not a complete fabrication of Israel. The true reason is that Israel wants to cause a breakdown of Al-Shifa. It wants to cause an emptying out of Al-Shifa because, as I said, it's a key social hub, and it's also served as the headquarters for all of the civilian arms of the local administration of the government that keeps the society alive and functioning. So obviously this is part of its very systematic attempt of emptying out the north, starving out the north, and forcing people to move south. This has obviously been its plan from day one, and it's continuing with that. And that's also how we should understand the targeting of the World Central Kitchen convoy of aid workers, because the very next day after it killed those 7 international volunteers, the WCK announced that it would be suspending its activities in Gaza. And ANERA also, sent an announcement to the same effect. So the Israeli campaign is actually working.
Israeli claims about the north and about Gaza City have been contradictory. On the one hand, Israel has continuously repeated that Hamas still poses a danger in the north, and that the main reason why they don't want civilians back to their homes is that that might help Hamas continue to fight in the north. On the other hand, they also claim to have completed and ensuring operational control in the north, whatever that means. Now, what we have been seeing is that fighting in the north hasn't stopped. The operations by Palestinian groups, especially the armed wing of Hamas, haven't stopped a day from the tip north of the Gaza Strip to the tip south of the Gaza Strip. Like every 2 days or so, there's new footage coming out from these groups showing their fighters engaging Israeli troops in the north. Israeli soldiers haven't been able actually even like to go around on foot in Gaza City and ensure positions in Gaza City. They still move around in armored vehicles. So on the one hand, they say we have full command and control. On the other hand, they say, no, Hamas is still fighting. What we know for sure is that both claims are crisscross contradictory in terms of location. In Al-Shifa itself, there was no fighting. In Al-Shifa itself, reports keep coming up, only quoting Israeli army sources at face value, that they killed this many terrorists, quote unquote, inside Al-Shifa, and that there was fighting inside Al-Shifa, trying to portray that the destruction of Al-Shifa was a result of some kind of crossfire, when in reality there was no fighting inside Al-Shifa. And even if there was 1 or 2 fighters, it doesn't explain the magnitude of the destruction. It doesn't explain setting entire floors on fire. On the other hand, what we have seen is that in the surroundings of Al-Shifa, in the neighborhood surrounding Al-Shifa, going from the Al-Shati refugee camp all the way to the central Gaza City, fighting has never stopped, even before the raids to Al-Shifa. So the Palestinian fighters have been engaging Israeli armored troops in the streets. So it's clear that the Israeli army hasn't been able to ensure control militarily in Gaza City and in the north. On the top of that, they can't allow civilian life to pick up again, because that would mean that months of campaigning, of genocidal campaign in Gaza, were for nothing, basically for nothing. And this shows that the real obstacle that Israel is trying to push against is not the armed force of Hamas and the Palestinian factions, but as the result of the Palestinian society. That is basically what Israel is trying to break, not the few hundreds of guerrillas going around, flip flops with RPGs. That's not exactly what Israel is fighting against, and that's exactly why Israel doesn't want people to go back to their homes, because they know the minute the war stops, from the rubble, people will pick up and start building from zero.
100%. And just to add to what Qassam said, just as further illustration, as Qassam said, the fighting and the resistance in the north has been ongoing and hasn't really stopped at any point. And obviously, the resistance is fighting from everywhere, but there has been not a shred of evidence shown that there were actual fighters from fighting from within the hospital. And it seems to me quite a coincidence that on the very day after the aid was successfully coordinated for the first time in months by the Gaza the civil government, that's when they decided to launch the invasion of Al-Shifa and to assassinate the person who was in charge of that aid transfer. So obviously that's the real goal. The real goal is to try and rob Palestinian society of its ability to function and to exist.
Do we have any insight into how they were able to pull off that successful aid distribution, getting supplies from the south all the way into Jabalia?
Yeah,
and you said that they distributed flyers. I mean, Israel is running surveillance over the Gaza Strip constantly. How were they able to do that without Israel knowing about it?
Well, I mean, first of all, it was done in a semi-clandestine way. So even the police escort wasn't dressed in police clothing because there had been a systematic targeting of police accompanying aid convoys in the past. And actually, the Biden administration had asked Israel to stop targeting the Hamas-run police that was accompanying that aid convoy. So obviously, there was a new need to act in a clandestine manner, and that's why the convoy was of masked gunmen. Now, of course, that was used as justification by Israel to say, "Oh, look, those are Hamas militants," but no, they were part of the Palestinian police force. Now, and how they were able to pull it off, Israel has a multifaceted and multi-layered sort of intelligence system. There's human intelligence, there's surveillance, there's drone surveillance, etc. But equally so, the Palestinians have been able to, in some cases, circumvent this. And Gaza is a very complex terrain, and it's a densely populated area, and they were able to pull it off. And I should also add that Faiq al-Mabhouh had coordinated this with a network of, first of all, international aid organizations and with UNRWA. And he'd coordinated this with what were called local committees or local tribal committees that were also in charge of the distribution of this aid. Now, also an important context of this is that these tribes are Hamas's the Hamas government's attempts to sort of preempt Israel's attempt to set up the clans and tribes of Gaza as an alternative rule. So they're kind of co-opting that and using that in a way that's actually productive for maintaining Palestinian presence in the north. And then those committees, those tribal and popular committees themselves, were also targeted. And only a few days ago, they announced that they're going to stop their operations of delivering aid to the north as well, because 70 of their members have been killed by Israel on these aid operations.
If you look at for example, the World Central Kitchen, whose team was targeted and massacred in Deir al-Balah, I mean, they were getting food into the Gaza Strip through the maritime route. So through via the sea. The Palestinian demand has been from the beginning to just open the land crossings, which is the normal route, the normal way to do it, and deliver food as it has been done historically through the UNRWA. and through other organisms linked to Gaza's government. What Israel was trying to do is through the maritime route, allowing some food, tons of food, but a drop in the ocean of the need in Gaza, through the sea, and the distribution being taken care of by NGOs like the World Central Kitchen, is in some way an attempt to use the need created by the siege to replace UNRWA and to replace the government bodies. Now, what Faris just explained, how the Hamas people, for example, like Faik al-Mabhouh, managed to use all what is at their disposal, including the work of these NGOs, to pull off a orderly distribution of food, and hence reinforcing their presence in the northern Gaza Strip, might have sent a signal to Israel that this is not working. If anything, is just helping, Hamas just restore order in the north in a different way. And it seems that replacing the UNRWA, even though it's one of the goals, while destroying the social order in the north and continuing to starve the people in Gaza, was a higher goal, which is why that can explain the strike on the WCK team earlier this week.
And just as a point of information, there are some rumors that the reason that the Israeli intelligence was able to get at Faik al-Mabhouh is through his meetings with some of these international aid organizations, that perhaps there were people in those aid organizations that were in some way, tied to the Israeli intelligence, or whether there was some sort of intelligence leak from those coordination meetings. And this is something that Haaretz itself has sort of conjectured about, and it said that this may be why the Israeli army very hastily launched the invasion of Al-Shifa only a day after the delivery of the aid. So it might be, so you're saying, how did that intelligence leak eventually happen? How they were able to get it? Might have been through the coordination also with some of the aid organizations as well. I mean, we don't have a confirmation, but it could be true.
No, and even if they don't have, even if they're not sending that kind of information back to the Israelis, they're I mean, it's well understood that they're all the NGOs are coordinating their movements with the Israelis. Right. So if they're going to go to a meeting, they're going to tell the Israelis, "We're sending our people to this meeting. Don't blow it up." Yeah. And they could, I'm assuming the Israelis could just very easily, track people leaving the meeting.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. They're obviously very heavily surveilled. Yeah.
Yeah. So this starts to lead us back to this discussion of what happens the day after, if we're talking about the collapse of civil society in Gaza. And I want to note that this day after construct is a colonialist framework. I hate it, but I'm curious if either of you have another way of approaching this discussion of what happens after this mass Israeli violence ends.
The day after is, well, it presumes many things, that the war will end in a certain way, and therefore, right, all the discussions about the day after involve mainly who will take care of the Gaza Strip. This, in some sort, takes into like as a predetermined outcome that Israel will be able to dismantle Hamas in some way. Something to take into consideration when we speak about the aftermath of the war is that Hamas is not like a group of people with guns. Hamas is an integral part of Palestinian society and social fabric. It's everywhere. It's in education. It's in charity. It's in business. It's everywhere. And whatever you do to Gaza, at some point, if there is a society left in Gaza, and it will begin to heal and to reconstruct itself at some point, it will involve Hamas. There's no two ways about it. Whether Hamas is in power, quote unquote, because what power can you have when you're under occupation? But if Hamas is running things in Gaza or not is irrelevant to the question. And I think that Hamas, even before October the 7th, were already looking for a way to get out of this responsibility, having to run Gaza without having to give away, their weapons, basically. But what will happen? I think that the main thing here is what will happen to the Palestinian society and social fabric. We have seen that this Palestinian people, especially in Gaza, have shown an a resolve that was not predicted by anyone. It's such a force of resistance on the, not like resistance like military fighting. I mean on keeping themselves together as a community, being able to continue to run medical operations with the entire health sector crumble to the ground, to scratch, being able to continuously, I mean, the Gaza municipality, at the same time that people went back to Al-Shifa, the employees of the municipality, no funds, no resources, nothing. They went back, they opened the municipality, and they began to assess the damage done to the city. So up to this point, Israel hasn't been able to break that. So whatever the political outcome of this will be, it will involve some recognition that the Palestinian society in Gaza has not been broken. And that will mean that Israel will need to acknowledge at some point in the future that this policy of genocide has proven to fail, and to have failed. And this needs to have some political implications on the international level. We need to move to some sort of different paradigm to solve the entire conflict, because the repercussions of this war aren't limited to Gaza. They're also reflected on Lebanon, on Yemen, on Iraq, on Syria, on the entire region, and on the West Bank, of course. So I think there is no way out of this without comprehensively looking at the root causes of the conflict, and Israel just coming to a point where it just admits that it just cannot simply destroy the Palestinian people by bombs.
Yeah. I would just want to echo a lot of what Qassam has been saying, but also just to emphasize that I think the quote unquote day after scenario really hinges on what happens in two areas. First of all, the ability of the Palestinians of Gaza to remain in their homes, whether it's in northern Gaza or in Gaza as is. That's number one. And number two, the ability of the Palestinian armed resistance, whether it be Hamas or the other groups, to remain sort of functional and able to maintain its level of military vitality, and to sort of engage in a long-term war of attrition with the Israeli army. Now, what Israel has been somewhat more successful in is to achieve gains on the non-military front, the front of causing mass displacement of Palestinians from the north to the south. Although it hasn't been successful in causing a complete ethnic cleansing, because right now the Egyptian border is holding. Whether that will continue to be the case is somewhat up in the air, but it does look like that the window for Israel to cause a total ethnic cleansing of Gaza may have hopefully been shut. But I don't want to say that and then to have a new sort of opening be opened in Israel's genocidal campaign, whether it be through some sort of regional development, or I'm not really sure what else might happen. But let us hope that does not come to pass. As for the military component, I feel, from what I've been able to glean from the information that is available to us, I feel that Israel has had relatively less success in terms of dismantling of the military capabilities of the Palestinian resistance. Obviously, Israel has clearly killed a certain level of Palestinian fighters, but it is not apparent to me that the declared number of around 10,000 fighters, it is not apparent to me that is anywhere near accurate, because and this is actually something that the testimony from Israeli soldiers and field commanders themselves are saying, where they say that it's astonishing, the reports of the number of quote unquote terrorists who are being killed. And I think the quote is that one of the field commanders or the reserve or one of the reservists has been saying that we all know that there aren't hundreds of Hamas fighters that are just running around and being killed. And so the official reported number of 10,000 Hamas militants killed is almost certainly a gross exaggeration. So, and what is apparent is that the ability of Hamas to move from the south to the north is also still intact to an extent, and this is evidenced by the launching of rockets from the north in the past week. So this means that absent some sort of black swan event where there's some sort of total ethnic cleansing or a regional development, I do not foresee the Palestinian resistance going anywhere. I do not see its. Ability to wage a long-term war of attrition being damaged, unless there is some sort of invasion of what is called the Philadelphia Corridor, which is basically the strip of land that separates the Rafah border from Egypt, which it has been surmised that this is one of the smuggling routes of Hamas weapons and supply lines. This is according to the Israeli intelligence, which, as we know, is not necessarily accurate, and probably Hamas has other sort of ways of smuggling in weapons, or maybe it's doing to an extent a certain amount of local manufacturing. So the question of being able to long term sort of replace its depleted stockpiles, whether it's of light weaponry or rockets, this is an open question as to whether it will be able to do so. I do not think that the horizon for them is closing in by any stretch. And so in whatever day after scenario, Israel will have to contend to the continuation of resistance and to the continuation of the presence of the people on the land. Their hope is that they will be able to get some sort of collaborationist native sort of like administrators. And they mentioned, as I said, the tribes and the clans. But now there's also an internal war being waged against those clans. And there's even been some talk that one of the mukhtars of one of the well-known sort of families was assassinated by Hamas, even though the evidence for that is not entirely clear and it might not be true, but it is obviously evidence that there is some sort of internal deterrence against that from within Gazan society, and of course also from the resistance and from Hamas as well. So I think that what we're looking at most likely is a long-term war of attrition scenario, unless of course there's some sort of black swan event that changes everything.
Yeah, I just want to add on these 2 points that Faris just mentioned. First, military-wise, I mean, this is not the first time that Israel attempts to whip off the map of Gaza, an attempt of military resistance. I mean, Palestinian armed resistance. We can safely say that it was born in Gaza in the first years right after the Nakba. And there was a time in the mid 70s that the Israeli army radio used to say that the army, ruled Gaza in the day, and that the Fidayeen, the Palestinian guerrillas, ruled Gaza in the night. And that attempt was largely destroyed by the Israeli army in the mid 70s up to the end of the 70s. At the time, the Muhammad Def of that time was a guy called Muhammad al-Aswad, and he was killed. And
Jivara Gaza.
Israel, the Guevara of Gaza, they used to call him. And Ariel Sharon personally oversaw the operations of transferring thousands of people from Gaza to refugee camps in the West Bank to clear entire areas so that the Israel army can cross through the refugee camps and isolate them from each other. So it was that crowded, you can imagine. And then the resistance picked off in the 80s. And then it grew in the 90s. And then it became what we know today as being, Hamas. And so we're talking from the early days of the even before the PLO until today. This is a war of attrition that has never stopped. That did not begin on the 7th of October. That will not end after the ceasefire is achieved. It just will continue. The intensity of it might change. We might not be seeing, long range or middle range rockets. We just be back to pistols, but just a matter of time before it picks up again. So this is just to say that the main point is, as I said before, is the root causes of the conflict in Gaza, particularly. I mean, the fact that 70 to 80% of the people in Gaza are refugees. This in and of itself is what the entire conflict is about. And I think that Israel's conscience has always been that this can only end if the Palestinians just give up and just forget, and the young forget, as Ben Gurion hoped after the old die. This didn't happen. Or that, at some point we just need to finish the job of 1948. If it doesn't work in this time, then I think that it necessarily needs to have political implications worldwide. To say, okay, it's time just to get on the table and just solve this conflict once and for all, and address what hasn't been addressed. What the Oslo Accords were postponed for the final stage of negotiations, basically the right of return, Jerusalem, the Palestinian statehood. And if I might say, because what Faris said is also very, very important, we can speak about the day after, ruling out entire scenarios, potential scenarios. This can end tonight. It could drag for a couple of months, from now, and end also with the ceasefire. But it can also blow into full-fledged war regionally in the entire Middle East. I mean, the front with Lebanon is heating up, the front with Iran is heating up, and we don't know what might happen. So I think that on this level, it doesn't only depend on the internal factors. I mean, on Israelis and Palestinians. Israelis and Palestinians and Lebanese and everybody involved in the region can't do as much. I think it depends largely on the international community, on the world, on how much pressure, because I think that Israel at some point is testing how far can it go. And it's up on the rest of the world to show Israel that, it went so far, it can't go, any further. And it largely depends on that, how this will end.
Qassam, you've been reporting on an incident that has not received much attention, but it may also point to what we're talking about here, the horizon for Gaza. The Interior Ministry in Gaza announced they arrested 10 intelligence officers from the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. Can you tell us what happened here?
Well, we don't really know what happened, because this was first reported by Hamas sources, first by the Interior Ministry in Gaza, and later by Hamas itself. And basically what they said was that a small force of up to 10 men belonging to the General Intelligence Branch of the Palestinian Authority, under the personal and direct direction of Majid Faraj. So Majid Faraj is the top official, and he's the head of the General Intelligence of the PA based in Ramallah, and one of the two strong candidates to succeed Mahmoud Abbas. That he personally oversaw this sending up to 10 men through trucks with belonging to the Egyptian Red Crescent, taking aid into Gaza, and that they had a secret mission. At first, they said that mission was to install chaos in the Gaza Strip, some kind of fifth column. Today, there were a little bit more details that they came out from Hamas, and they said that they had to basically their mission was to contact local tribal contacts to try and establish a sort of network of people who would work together with the PA in coordination with Israel to just take things from the hands of Hamas in a sense. And that was not coordinated with Hamas. That was not coordinated with anyone. It was coordinated with the Israeli army. It was completely secretive. Hamas even said that the Egyptians told them that they had no knowledge about this. So it's clearly, from the perspective of Hamas, a hostile action. So they arrested them. Now, the Palestinian Authority first just denied everything, and they said that Hamas are just being delusional. They're just saying whatever because they just want to cover up the mess that they've created in Gaza and so on and so forth. Majid Faraj himself didn't speak on the subject, but it's curious to note that 3 or 4 days before this announcement came out from Hamas, Yoav Gallant himself, the war minister of Israel, was saying that there are attempts to coordinate, that the U.S. is trying to coordinate something with Faraj, not with the PA, with Majid Faraj personally, to try and create some sort of alternative to Hamas in the quote-unquote day after. So it's just curious how things just came like so successively, So up to this point, we don't know. But I think that something important to note is that in the Palestinian public opinion, there is absolutely no one who came out like, no, this is just impossible. They would never do it. On the contrary, everyone was, they could do that. I mean, Majid Faraj could do something like that. I mean, just the fact that this could potentially be true and that Palestinians, take it as a real possibility. They would expect Majid Faraj to do something like that. The PA to do something like that speaks a lot, says a lot about how internal politics, Palestinian internal politics, are working. I just and what state they're on. I just like to indicate something that is happening right now. Is that the PA just appointed a new government for the West Bank. Supposedly, the same ministers are supposed to run things in Gaza, theoretically. But things in Gaza, I mean, like the health minister is supposed to, theoretically, to be the same health minister. There's one minister that is in Ramallah. But on the ground, there's separate bodies, and the one in Gaza is run by Hamas. So there's this new government. And as soon as this new government was announced, before even the names were put out, a coalition of Palestinian factions, including Hamas, including the Islamic Jihad, including other secular, non-armed Palestinian factions like the Palestinian National Initiative and the People's Party and also the PFLP, came out in a joint statement condemning and saying this is not right because we are supposed to discuss this together. What kind of government will for a national unity government. And just weeks before, all the factions were meeting in Moscow. And apparently they agreed in Moscow to form a national unity government. And then Abbas comes out with this new government, out of the blue. So it's clear that the PA is on one side having internal talks with other Palestinian factions just to keep, the appearance of we're doing this, we're trying to organize, the internal Palestinian affairs together in a national unity fashion. But on the other hand, they're working with the United States on basically really organizing the day after through, people that they would choose. And that, of course, that would be in line with the requirements of Israel, which makes this claim by Hamas completely expected and completely possible. And it just says a lot about how things are internally in the Palestinian politics.
So this is a good segue because I want to turn to events in the West Bank. Obviously, Gaza draws everyone's attention, but the occupation continues in the West Bank. Settler attacks on Palestinians increased after October 7, and that remains at an elevated level. The Israeli military conducts raids and incursions in Palestinian communities in every region of the West Bank. You both live there. Can you describe what you're seeing and what you're hearing from your contacts?
Well, so briefly, there's been a slow encirclement of the Palestinian armed resistance in the West Bank ever since essentially ever since October 7th and well into today. Just to give listeners a bit of background, Palestinian armed resistance within the West Bank sort of was dismantled and died after the Second Intifada in the early 2000s. And it has, however, seen some sort of a resurgence during the past 2 years, especially in the northern part of the West Bank, cities like Jenin and Nablus and Tulkarem. And you had the rise and fall of different armed formations going under different names, and they've been notably cross-factional and not tied to any particular faction. Also notably, Hamas was not a main actor in those groups. There was talk that the Palestinian Islamic Jihad had some role in funding them or fomenting or organizing them. But also, a lot of the people who were engaged in that armed resistance were people from a traditionally sort of Fatah background, but people that are disaffected with the PA and are against the PA. And so you've had this armed sort of formation developing slowly in fits and starts. And you've had this Israeli low intensity, quote unquote, low intensity counterinsurgency campaign that's developed over the past 2 years. And it was called Operation Break the Wave. And it was announced, I think, in 2021 or early 2022 when that started. And it sort of continued in a low intensity format where certain areas or neighborhoods or refugee camps would be sectioned off. The Israeli army would go in and little by little, those areas became these quote unquote self-defense zones where the Israeli army would avoid entering because there would be a higher likelihood of them sustaining casualties because they would be going into unfamiliar terrain, especially in Jenin refugee camp. This was all before October 7. Post October 7, with all eyes on Gaza, there was a renewed effort to take it from breaking the wave to wiping out the armed resistance in the West Bank. And what we've seen, the first few months were a little bit pessimistic for the prospects of the armed resistance, because many of the main founders of these groups or key figures in those groups were being assassinated left and right. And then something happened. What happened is that you had the formation of even more groups. So, for instance, Jenin was known as this sort of hotbed of Palestinian armed resistance. It was called the Wasp's Nest by the Israeli intelligence. Some very key figures were assassinated post October 7th. And then armed operations from the Jenin area continued. And then you had the spread of more armed groups to neighboring areas like Qabatia, like Ya'bad. These are areas from around Jenin and in the northern West Bank, and in the Tulkarem area as well. So what we've seen, and we've covered some of this in Mondoweiss, we've had some really good pieces put out from a Palestinian journalist based in Jenin. Her name is Shadha Hanaisha, and she has been documenting in exhaustive detail this sort of moment in Palestinian history where you've had, even under such a brutal military onslaught after October 7, you've had the persistence of this armed presence in a way that I think is kind of unprecedented. So I would have expected that they sort of served the historical role of, distracting Israel while October 7th was being planned for. But no, actually, they've persisted. They have not been wiped out yet. Maybe I'm speaking too soon, but I found that there's a surprising persistence of these armed formations in the West Bank. And it's even gotten to the point now where, to bring this back to the PA, where the PA itself has now been launching a campaign. First, it was a campaign of arrests. Now it's a campaign of attempted assassinations. This is also very important. I don't know, Qassam, if you wanted to comment on that part specifically or anything else I've been talking about up until now.
Yeah, sure. Well, in the West Bank, Faris has been talking about the armed resistance. Just a couple of things about the armed resistance in the north of the West Bank. It's important to know that this is a phenomenon that began to appear in 2020, and it basically crystallized in 2021 after the prison break from the Jalbour or the Gilboa high security Israeli prison of 6 Palestinians. That was like the catalyst. That was the event that brought many Palestinian youth in the north to arms. And it's also impossible to rule out the hypothesis that organized factions like the Islamic Jihad particularly, have been involved in preparing the grounds for this, like smuggling weapons and providing resources. But what was really interesting is that these groups were, for the first time, trans-factional. I mean, they're something like the Lion's Den in Nablus. There were people involved from all backgrounds. And everything that Faris spoke about was already happening before October the 7th. The leaders of the Lions Den were being assassinated before October the 7th, like Wadi al-Hawah, or like Tamer Kilani, for example, or like the founder, Ibrahim Nabulsi. And this was just fueling this phenomenon. More and more young people were coming into the Tul Karam Brigade. Began in 2022, basically, and it began like as a convergence of a local Islamic Jihad group with a local Fatah group and another group that had nothing to do with any factions. Were trying to imitate the Lions Den, calling themselves the Hawk's Nest or the Falcon's Nest, something like that. They came together and formed the Tul Karam Brigade. So this was already happening. But what's important to note is that the Israeli response to this phenomenon increased qualitatively after October the 7th. In a sense, all the elite units of the Israeli army became engaged or committed on the Gaza front, which means that they had less experienced soldiers to deal with these kind of groups. And this was immediately noticed, because in some raids, like in Tul Karam, they began to have losses and like up to 7 and 8 soldiers wounded. So what they did was tighten the grip on not only on the north with more and more violent raids into Jenin, into Tul Karam, like days-long raids, bulldozing everything, which in Jenin itself had been happening, but then they began to do this in Tul Karam as well, and in Tubas too. But also the grip on the entire civilian population from north to south. So one thing that we noted right after October 7th is that, for example, military checkpoints doubled or even tripled across the West Bank. Roads that were open for more than 10 years were immediately closed. And in such a fashion that there's no way to go through those roads anymore. Checkpoints themselves began to become more and more brutal. I mean, in the first early months right after October the 7th, Palestinians were stopped and their phones were being checked by the soldiers. And if they saw that you had Telegram, for example, that you watched videos coming from Gaza, you could be arrested, stripped of your clothes, beaten, whatever. And people began to avoid leaving their towns if they didn't have something to do, something really important to do. And arrests spiked like crazy. Since October 7th, according to the Palestinian prisoner support groups, there are more than 7,600 Palestinians arrested since October the 7th. To give you a perspective, in all of 2023, there was something like the highest year, up to since the second Intifada in arrests throughout the year. There were like 3,000 arrests. Since October the 7th, in 6 months, we're already at 7,600. You can imagine. I mean, the administrative detainees, people who are detained without charges, there are 3,500. That's the last count that I checked. I mean, the peak, the last peak we had was in 2002. In the second Intifada, it was at 2,000. So you can imagine, just to put in perspective. So what's happening in the West Bank right now is unique. And it all only looks small in comparison to Gaza. It's because what is happening in Gaza is so brutal, so unprecedented, that the West Bank, fades in comparison. But if there was nothing happening in Gaza, or much less than we're seeing, you would have like all the eyes on the West Bank, because what's happening is really unique. In like the second Intifada, we haven't seen this. And I might add something else. another thing that we saw since October the 7th in the West Bank was this spike in settler violence. So settlers just were unleashed, completely unleashed. According to the Palestinian groups engaged, in supporting communities in the remote areas, threatened by settlers, including the official Commission for Resistance to the Wall and Settlements, which is a PA organism. Already 25 communities have been completely expelled. They just don't exist anymore. 2 months ago, I was speaking to a guy who was the mayor of a village called Zanuta in the southern hills of Hebron. And he told me, I am an ex-mayor, a former mayor, because Zanuta doesn't exist anymore. Zanuta had some 400 residents, and in a single day, Israeli settlers just told him, you need to leave or we're going to kill you. You, your children, everybody. And they just had to leave. Just like 3 kilometers from where I'm speaking right now, another village, Wadi Sikh, of like 40 families, they're expelled on the 12th of October. The entire village doesn't exist anymore. So this began to happen.
Where are these people going?
Well, this is a very underreported, undercovered issue, because what happens after they're expelled is even more difficult, more tragic, if you want, because most of these people are Bedouins, and Bedouins in Palestine aren't like Arabian Bedouins. These are semi-sedentary and semi-nomad people. So they stay in a place. They have their village, but they move around a lot because their economy depends on herding. So they need large spaces to maintain their way of life, a centuries-old way of life. It's just their culture. Now they are forced to move to the periphery of villages, and villages is different because people in the villages, they have their gardens, their olive trees. You can't herd there, and this increases social tensions with people. Give you an example. Like in my town, people are all the time fighting with these Bedouins because they find their sheep in their olive trees. So what they are forced to do is to sell their capital, because like buying feed for their animals increases the cost so much that it doesn't work economically anymore. And their capital is their livestock. It's their capital. So they're just selling it off, giving up their capital, their culture, their way of life, just to have cash to sustain their families until they find somewhere to settle, basically living on other people's lands that they just allow them to be there. And this is happening before our eyes. I mean, this is exactly what we read about in the early 50s, right after the Nakba, happening today in the West Bank. Hundreds of families being forced to do that, to give up everything and their way of life and their culture, and invest in one kid's education in the hope that in 15, 20 years time, he'll just, pull his family out of this situation, because the only way that they have ahead is to become construction workers for Israelis, because the construction sector in the Palestinian economy, it is in hiring, these days. So it's a systematic destruction of a part of the Palestinian society, of a component, cultural component of Palestine. It's much more than just evacuating land from of people,
Yeah. So the engineering the collapse of civil society in Gaza right now through a genocidal scale war, engineering the social collapse of Palestinian culture, society in the West Bank through the continuing pressure of the occupation and dislocation of people.
Exactly.
As we wrap up here and survey the situation, looking at reporting today that the sticking point, and I think this came up earlier in the conversation, that the sticking point in negotiations between Hamas and Israel is the return of displaced Palestinians to northern Gaza. Mm-hmm. The Israeli killing of the World Central Kitchen staff that we talked about, it does seem to have shifted Western public and Western government positions further towards supporting a ceasefire, which by and large they already do. The group of the elders today put out a statement calling on governments around the world to suspend arms transfers to Israel. I want to know what you both are tracking as important developments for us to watch in the coming 1 or 2 weeks. Not a day after analysis, but if we're going to see a hostage exchange, a full ceasefire, What are you looking for to develop in the coming days? Faris?
How to go fast?
Yeah. So in terms of what I'm looking at for the prospects of a hostage exchange, I think that here the main issue is whether Hamas is able to sort of stick to the key parts of its demands, which is first of all to maintain a presence in the north, as you said, and also to hedge as part of whatever initial stage of a hostage exchange, to include within it some sort of permanent ceasefire, because Hamas obviously realizes that its only leverage right now in any kind of negotiations is the hostages. And so it wants to try and extract as much as it can from them. And what it would want to do is to try and, by any means necessary, to ensure, first of all, the survival of the population and its ability to survive and not to be subjected to, the ongoing genocide and starvation and famine. And so a key component of that would be demands for full and unbridled access to aid and humanitarian assistance, and also to the resettlement of people to northern Gaza in order to prevent the creation of some sort of buffer zone or a bifurcation of Gaza into north and south. And then to be able to manage to ensure its military presence on the ground and its ability to continue to resist Israel and to harry Israel in any way, or indeed to negotiate some sort of cessation of hostilities through the withdrawal, whether partial or total, of Israel. Now, obviously, the Israelis don't want to accept any of those. And the only situation in which Israel might be pushed to do so is if either there is some sort of political shift within Israel, where either the Netanyahu government is in some way toppled or replaced, or absent that Hamas is able to hold out simply longer than the Israelis. Time is not on the side of the Israelis right now, because there is increasing pressure from the Biden administration and from internally from within Israeli society to reach some sort of hostage deal. Pressure is also obviously being built on the side of Hamas, because a genocide is ongoing. And Israel has been successful in making the negotiations about alleviating the genocidal conditions rather than them being about other things. And so already Israel has been hoping, when Netanyahu is saying that our campaign is helping the hostage negotiations, what he really means is that we are going to make the people of Gaza suffer so much and make their lives so miserable that the negotiation will be over how to alleviate those conditions, rather than to be about, uh, uh, improving their lives from how they were even before October 7, to have a lifting of the blockade, etc. So you have this sort of Israeli recalcitrance and sort of um, unwillingness to allow for Palestinians essentially to breathe, and it really all rides on whether the resistance and the people are able to outlast Israel's determination to wipe them out.
Qassam, you get the last word.
Yeah, well, I think that we should be looking at multiple fronts, so to speak. First of all, yes, what is happening internally in Gaza, especially on the humanitarian level, because that's where the entire game is played. It's about how much longer Palestinians in the Gaza Strip can just resist, can just hold together. So far, it's been heroic, and as a journalist, I don't use words that are not just strict facts, but there is no other way to describe it. I mean, under this pressure, any other society would have collapsed. But the fact of being heroic doesn't mean that we should just count on it, because these are human beings, these are families, these are children. and how longer can they hold together. And I think that this is the bet that Netanyahu and his government are doing. So we should be looking very closely at the humanitarian situation that is already very, very dire. I mean, that's just a very modest or conservative description. It's just catastrophic. But I mean, I would be looking at the health sector, especially the remaining hospitals, the Nasser Hospital, for example, in Khan Yunis, which is under a lot of pressure in the recent days. And it's basically now the Al-Shifa number 2 in the function that it accomplishes in the south. On the other level, I would be also looking at the Palestinian political scene and how it evolves in terms of the Palestinian Authority, this new government, what this new government will be able to do. Will it be able to try to breach a little bit the gap with the other factions, the Palestinian factions, and try to come up with a national unity? Because this is the main point. I mean, if there's a national unity leadership that this new Prime Minister, Mohammed Mustafa, can at least move towards, this could open more ways, more scenarios for a political end of this war. And of course, at the north with Hezbollah, with how it plays out there, because it's really at the brink of just exploding into a full-fledged war. But I would also be looking mostly, and I think a lot of Palestinians are looking at the international scene. How longer would the governments of the U.S., the European Union, the UK, mainly the powers that are sustaining Israel in this war and in enabling it to prolong it as long as possible, just to be inactive in front of the rising call to end this war and for a ceasefire by the citizenry. And this depends a lot on the citizens themselves, on the solidarity movement, and how longer people can be committed in the streets, on social media, everywhere, pushing for a change of policy. Because if this gets normalized, regardless of how it ends, it doesn't paint a bright future for anyone in the world in coming years.
We'll end there. Faris Giacaman, Qassam Muaddi, thank you so much for joining us today to talk about these developments.
Thanks.
Thank you a lot.
That's our show. Mondoweiss is a nonprofit publication with no paywalls. If you would like to support our work, please go to mondoweiss.net/donate. Please leave a rating and review to help other listeners find the show. Subscribe to one of our free email newsletters so you can stay up to date on events in Palestine and related politics here in the U.S. and around the world. Finally, if you have any more feedback, send me an email at dave@mondoweiss.net. Thanks for listening. We'll be back soon with a new episode.